Early next year, we'll flight test the huge 3-stage Saturn V rocket, which will transport 3 Apollo astronauts to the moon. Now, one means of preparing ourselves for the future is to educate by entertaining. The following film describes an unusual motion picture now being produced in London for release all over the world starting early in 1967.
The first time I saw 2001, I believe it was in Hollywood at the Pantages Theater. I didn't understand why they kept calling it a drug movie, and they were saying, well, the idea is you take drugs and then you go to the movie. I went in there, you know, clean as a whistle, and I came out of there altered myself. That film was the drug.
You know, this isn't just a science fiction film. The best way that I can begin to explain it is to paraphrase Stanley Kubrick. He said, how do you explain a Beethoven symphony? You can't. You experience it.
12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
Of course, nobody actually went on the moon until 1969, a year after the film came out. So it's quite interesting the way Kubrick had to completely visualize and make real things that had never occurred.
We're in the final assembly building of the LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, which will take 2 American astronauts down to the surface of the moon. And in 2001, Stanley Kubrick and I have set ourselves several objectives. We hope to convey to the public the wonder and beauty and promise of the new age of exploration, which is opening up before the human race.
The movie suffers from a great optimism of the 60s that we all had. And Stanley was there too, thinking, boy, you know, this is going to progress and, you know, we're going to have all these things in place by 2001, which was, you know, what, 25, 35 years later.
Out on the moon and planets are the new frontiers which our age needs so desperately. The next generation will explore the planets, bringing back new knowledge, answering old questions, and of course, asking fresh ones.
There were some assumptions made by Clarke and Kubrick in picking the year 2001 that if the space race continued at the pace that it did in the 60s, I mean, space kind of fell out of fashion in the 70s, but we didn't know that was going to happen. It was quite possible that we might have, you know, a man on Mars by the year 2000.
I'm surprised. We went to the moon and then stopped. Oh, okay, here's the moon.
I am disappointed that space travel, unlike air travel, didn't take off.
Don't forget, when Kubrick made 2001, we had not yet seen what the Earth looked like from space.
Looking back at the film now, it still looks great. It still looks real. It still looks authentic. And I think that's part of the genius of the film.
He was so successful in portraying the future, we haven't quite gotten to artificial intelligence as portrayed, almost, but not quite. But many things have come true. For example, the iPad that we see, Skyping, etc., etc.
He took you into space for the first time. I mean, since 2001, no documentary, no other movie, no IMAX experience being on the shuttle and looking down at Earth has ever really put me in space as much as 2001 did.
There's a lot of accuracy of which I am very proud to have been a part of. The depiction of Jupiter in the movie is pretty close to what Jupiter really looks like. And Jupiter's moons look pretty close to what Jupiter's moons turned out to actually look like.
The most amazing remark that was made was by the astronauts when they finally got into orbit and when they went to the moon. And they would say it was like 2001.
Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke believe everything in their film will be possible in the next century.
Since 2001 was released all those years ago, it built up a huge kind of cult following, didn't it? What was the reason for that, do you think?
I don't know. It's puzzled me. Of course, Stanley Kubrick's genius was the real reason.
I had few intellectual interests as a child, and I don't think I read a book for pleasure until after I graduated high school. In retrospect, I don't feel that I missed reading that many books, and I felt that I caught up pretty quickly when I became interested in things in general. I had one thing, I think, that perhaps helped me get over being a misfit, a school misfit, and that is that I became interested in photography. I started out by just, getting a camera and learning how to take pictures and learning how to print pictures and so on and so on. And then finally trying to find out how you could sell pictures and, would it be possible to be a professional photographer? And it was a case of over a period of, say, from the age of 13 to 17, you might say, going through step by step by myself without anybody really helping me, the problem solving of becoming a photographer. This particular thing about problem solving is something that schools generally don't teach you. If you can develop a kind of generalized approach to problem solving, it's surprising how it helps you in anything. So I think that photography might have been more valuable than doing the proper things in school. Like everybody else, I was always very interested in movies, and I used to go to see films. A friend of mine, who subsequently has become a film director named Alex Singer, was working as an office boy at the March of Time. One day he told me that it cost $40,000 to make a March of Time, and it was a one-reeler. And I said to him, gee, that's a lot of money. I said, I can't believe it cost that much to make, 8 or 9 minutes of film. I then found out how much feature films were being made for. Millions, and I had calculated that I could make a feature film for about $10,000. I mean, at this point, I was the whole crew, cameraman, assistant cameraman, director, everything. And of course, there really can't be very much more to making a feature film, and I certainly couldn't make one worse than the films that I kept seeing every week.
I had a phone call to say, would I be available to meet Mr. Kubrick? And so I went along to MGM. So I walked onto the stage and there was a painter on the stage. And I went up to him and I said, I'm looking for Stanley Kubrick. You haven't seen him around, have you? And he said, I am Stanley Kubrick.
I would imagine to anyone sort of looking at me, I have a sort of vague, withdrawn look on my face because what I'm just doing is thinking about what I'm about to do or what other scenes. Why don't I just use the time to think? That's all.
This man, dressed in a sort of disheveled blue suit and trousers, eating a sausage, half-eaten sausage, was Stanley Kubrick and not a painter.
He wouldn't let anybody on the set. Nobody was from MGM was allowed on the set. If they wanted Stanley Kubrick to do a film, he did it his way.
And I just remember thinking, this guy's kind of a magical, wonderful guy, And I was so nervous. I remember talking to Sidney and saying, listen, what happens if I don't like a word? I mean, what's it going to be like? I mean, can I, what do I say to him? I don't want to offend him. And Sidney was thinking, he's human, you just talk to him. I say, oh yeah, of course, I just talked to him.
With Tom, we regularly went to take above 70 and 80 takes all the time.
It's so rare that you would ever get to the point where you'd say to the actor, look, this is my picture, and you're working for me, and you do it the way I want, or go home. Because what you really want him to do is to feel confident and enjoy what he's doing. Otherwise, he's not going to be able to do it very well. So
what was he like to work with? Well, of course, as an actor, I can tell you that he was absolutely extraordinary.
Kubrick was very benign. He was very soft-spoken, never raised his voice.
If, and it was a big if, he trusted you.
I loved him, but I would be lying if I didn't say that there were times when he was incredibly difficult.
I think Stanley was always waiting for that one take that would be the breakthrough take, where the actors would surprise him and blow him away with things that he couldn't even think of.
I do remember an instance before we started shooting Clockwork. We were standing outside, and I rather innocently just asked him how he directed his films, because I'd sort of been used to working with some people from the theater who were nurturing to actors.
He'd turn on you in a moment and say, all right, you're the big fella, let's see it. And that's about as harsh as he ever got with me. He was a completely different director with Shelley.
Right. Oh, come on. What do you mean roll video?
Seconds.
We're killing ourselves out here, and you're going to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing right by the
music?
door.
unless the actor is incapable of doing what you're asking him to do, gets insecure and thinks of a lot of reasons why you're wrong, but really what he's trying to do is avoid failing, you know. But then really you should try to figure out what the limitations of the actors are and never put them in a spot like that.
Well, he looked at me with a blank stare and he said, gee, Malk, I don't know what I want, but I do know what I don't want.
I tend to believe that if you're right, people realize it.
But I don't remember a lot of direction. It was all in the script. Everything we needed was there.
I immediately called for a call sheet and said, look at this, Stan, says here. Hey, S. Kubrick, director. How about a little direction? So he burst out laughing, and that's the way our relationship pretty much was.
Well, I think about whatever problems are problems. I mean, sometimes manipulating the actors aren't the problem. Sometimes the problem is the story or the schedule. But whatever it is, I always have plenty to think about.
I realized that actually he'd given me the greatest gift of all. He'd actually given me a blank canvas to come in and just do whatever I wanted.
2001, A Space Odyssey is a challenging film about man's place in the universe and where he is headed.
Our aim was to give a mature treatment of the theme of space exploration.
I wasn't satisfied to just make an interesting film. I wanted it to be a very poetic and meaningful film.
I went through my short stories and dug out 6 which seemed appropriate, and I sold them all to Stanley. And one by one, he threw them away, and I bought them back. And Stanley decided that the best way to produce the film was to write a novel, or at least the outline of a novel, first. We finally settled on one short story originally called The Sentinel.
In praise of Arthur C. Clarke, he is, I think, the most poetic science fiction writer. Right, he is scientifically the best informed. His narrative ideas, I think, are, for my tastes, the most appealing.
Stanley was specifically interested in the possibility of life in outer space and what would happen if we encountered it or it encountered us. So that was the basic theme he was interested in.
The story is, just sort of razor thin. Stanley tried to take a basic literary work and do it visually without words.
Of course, there have been innumerable movies about space in the past. 1 or 2 of them were sincere and reasonably successful. Most of them, unfortunately, were, let's not mince words, junk.
A lot of the science fiction up to that point, especially during the 50s, had been very bee-oriented, which is a giant monster, a giant ant, a giant this.
And I'm afraid, to some extent, they have prejudiced people against this kind of movie. This is now going to change.
He would tell me the last couple of years of his life, when we were talking about the form, he kept saying, I want to change the form. I want to make a movie that changes the form. And I said, well, didn't you do that with 2001? He said, just a little bit, but not enough.
He wasn't content with just making a good science fiction movie. He was Kubrick and always had to push the envelope.
We've been brought in here by Stanley Kubrick to more or less ensure the scientific integrity of the film.
They had beautiful models of their concepts for the weightlessness effects and the upside down sets, and I was just blown away. I just thought this is some kind of nirvana.
I was a mime, and I went and I showed him what I could do, and he hired me on the spot because I understood that the movement wasn't the solution. The solution was to motivate the movement. And so I would come to the zoo alone every day. I built the choreography from different animals, different parts of the body, at different speeds.
Stanley was walking back to the studio, and he had a broomstick, and he was throwing this broomstick up in the air. And I was quite worried that it might come down on him. And I think that was when he got the idea of this transition, which of course is what happened. The bone goes up and turns into what is supposed to be an orbiting space bomb.
We had to make a pen float in space, so we devised a rig, which was a large circular sheet of glass. And then we had some double-sided tape, newly invented, and we put the pen on the with the double-sided tape on the glass, and then we rotated the glass so it floated in space.
2001 was the beginning of a genuine revolution of visual effects.
When you look at it now and realize that he did it all on film, it's beyond me.
Some of the shots involve so much engineering. I mean, you see the entire set rotating and the camera follows and the actors have to hit certain marks, otherwise they will fall down because the set rotates.
It was an amazing set. If you could imagine a Ferris wheel, but an enclosed Ferris wheel where all the set is built on the inside surfaces of the Ferris wheel and the lights on the outside shining in, and it could be separated so that you could shoot various ways for close-ups this way, or put it together and revolve at about 3 miles an hour while Gary ran around. There's one shot, which is an amazing shot, all within one frame, where Gary is at the top of the wheel, sitting at a table. I climb down a ladder from the hub to the bottom of the wheel, and apparently, because it's all one frame, walk up the side of the wheel to an upside down position and slide in next to him.
The thing was to try to be cool, like I'm not upside down. And Kubrick, he said, all right, Lockwood on action, start eating. And I stuck a fork into it, and it fell 65 feet to the bottom of the centrifuge. End of that day. That little tiny simple shot with Keir walking up to me took us about 3 or 4 days to finally get.
Film directing, I think, is a misnomer for anybody that seriously wants to make films, because directing the film is only, you might say, 1/3 of the process. You know, writing the film, directing the film, and then editing the film.
Music played a big part of the editing process because, of course, the visual effects sequences, no dialogue. How do you judge the pacing of the scene? How do you judge how long the visual effects should necessarily be?
Before Stanley Kubrick, music tended to be used in films as either decorative or as heightening emotions. After Stanley Kubrick, because of his use of classical music in particular, it became absolutely an essential part of the narrative, intellectual drive of the film.
Most films today are very busy with sound. There's dialogue constantly. There's music that's very dense with a big orchestra. 2001 is really at the opposite end of that kind of style, where you kind of have one sound at a time. For example, wonderful sequences in the film where you just hear the breathing astronaut. And that breathing is like music.
Stanley was very unsure of the voice for Hal. So he said, I'll worry about it in post-production. So he just turned to his assistant director. Derek Cracknell was British, and his voice was a little like Michael Caine. It sounded like this. Oh, I can't do it now. It's all like this. You know what I mean? Dive. Better take a stress pill. Oh, I can't do that, Dave. It was all like that, you know? It was a bit like working with Michael Caine. That took acting.
I suppose Hal is the most memorable character in the movie. It's often said that computers can only do what we tell them to do, but that is no longer true. They can be so complicated that they do develop personalities and do things we don't expect. In fact, anyone who's had a laptop knows perfectly well that computers can have a personality.
One of the best examples for my contribution to the film is what's known as the slit scan sequence, the Stargate sequence. There was a lot of evolution to that concept. And I had remembered, but knowing of an experimental filmmaker who was exploring this whole idea of long time exposures, and while the camera shutter is open, he would move various kinds of artwork or slits around in front of the camera to scan color blocks. And I thought, well, if you took what he was doing, which was kind of flat and two-dimensional, and made it three-dimensional in the Z-axis, that you could create this streak exposure. And I walked that minute down to Stanley's office. Stanley, I think this is the answer to the Stargate. And he looked at it and he said, I think you could be right. And that's an example of my whole experience on 2001 was support from Stanley to explore, experiment, take risks, and produce something that was different.
Do you show what they look like? You know, all aliens in any space film, they're from central casting, obviously. Real aliens won't look anything like human beings. So what to do? Well, we avoided that completely by never showing them.
What is the ending? Why did Stanley design it the way he did?
I think I may have contributed the idea of specifically never returning to the younger age, but that he would suddenly cut to whatever it was the younger version saw, and you'd cut to the older version looking back at the first version, but the first version wasn't there anymore. I don't remember Stanley defining it. But then that's kind of the magic of this film, is that nothing is tied up neatly. And maybe Stanley didn't 100% know for sure himself.
Stanley told me that the first screening of that movie was in Washington. It was for the Politico.
We had all the executives sitting in the audience, very old, many of them, and they didn't understand the film at all and left, whole rows of them.
So there was a guy from MGM there with a counter. And so Stanley goes, he goes, there have been 378 people that have left this movie.
Got up and walked out.
Oh, I'm sure he counted them, too.
And I'm really fond of quoting the MGM executive who said, well, that's the end of Stanley Kubrick.
Woke up to the sounds of a DJ saying, this is the most fantastic film, and the people are queuing around the block. And I was desperately trying to ring Stanley to tell him.
The interesting thing about that film, if it hadn't have been for the counterculture,
and the LSD.
Yeah, the potheads, right.
Some people like it enormously. You know, it was just the Blue Rinse Brigade that walked out.
And then they'd put out sort of rumors about, you know, one of the apes had sneakers on and they'd all go back, being high as kites, looking for the sneakers that weren't there, of course.
The craft is impeccable. Every film he's ever made, the craft is impeccable. You know, there's the compositions. I mean, the exact compositions. You had to hit your mark precisely to please Stanley so he'd get his painting, the painting he was putting on canvas for you.
Well, the thing about Stanley is I think that he's a filmmaker's filmmaker. I mean, I think he's one of those guys that if you start studying film, you start learning about film and try to make film, you begin to look at his work and you just stand in awe.
And then there's that rarest of films where when you see it continually over years, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, you still see more in it.
2001 is the grandfather of all such films.
And every science fiction film that's followed it is a part of its heritage.
And when we take that dare, we're transported directly to his world, and we're inside his vision. And in the whole history of movies, there's been nothing like that vision ever. It was a vision of hope and wonder, of grace and of mystery. It was a gift to us, and now it's a legacy.
2001: A Space Odyssey is a film that sets us thinking about the most profound questions of our existence. And that is why, nearly 40 years after its first release, it still has such compelling power on audiences all over the world. It was and is a remarkable achievement.